If you have ever watched a program like Grand Designs, and you know that there is pretty much in every episode that moment, that bit where a crisis unfolds. The building project for that dream home comes up against a big obstacle that is either going to mean having to cut back on the project and cut some corners and compromise, or somehow, in some way, a whole load of extra money is going to have to be found. Sometimes this means quite significant delays, often running over years. Last year, there was an episode which it was described at the time as the saddest episode of Grand Designs ever. It was a house that was supposed to cost £1.8 million, which is a lot of money. It was supposed to take 18 months to build this house. 9 years later, it is unfinished still. And the couple who were doing it, their marriage sadly ended, and they are £4 million in debt with it unfinished. Now, programs like this are part of a genre that has been described as DIY, doom it yourself. It makes you think, didn't these people watch any of these programs before they set out on this grand design, before they did this project? If they had, then surely they would know that the best thing to do is to get a competent project manager on board who knows what they're doing, rather than just trying to go it alone. It does seem like it is quite very much a part of human nature that we like to dive into things feet first and I guess hope for the best. Sometimes it does work out. Quite often it doesn't work out so well. But as we finish this series on becoming authentic disciples of Jesus, we're going to take a look at Luke chapter 14, which talks about the need to go into following Jesus with eyes open. This is from Luke chapter 14, starting at verse 25. It says this: Large crowds were traveling with Jesus, and turning to them he said, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple. And whoever does not carry their cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. Suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Won't you first sit down and estimate the cost to see if you have enough money to complete it? For if you lay the foundation and are not able to finish it, everyone who sees it will ridicule you, saying, 'This person began to build and wasn't able to finish.' Or suppose a king is about to go to war against another king. Won't he first sit down and consider whether he is able with 10,000 men to oppose the one coming against him with 20,000? If he is not able, he will send a delegation while the other is still a long way off and will ask for terms of peace. In the same way, those of you who do not give up everything you have cannot be my disciples. Salt is good, but if it loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is fit neither for the soil nor for the manure heap. It is thrown out. Whoever has ears to hear, let them hear." About 10 years or so ago, I finished quite a big piece of research work that I was doing for a course I was on, and it was looking at influence techniques in Christian youth work. Now, that wasn't because I wanted to find good influence techniques that I could use, but I wanted to avoid using those techniques. I wanted to avoid being in a situation where I might use them inadvertently. And I was well aware that words like manipulation and brainwashing could be applied. I even found a simple definition of the term brainwashing. It was on the Urban Dictionary, and it simply said that brainwashing was the purpose of churches. It's quite an accusation. Now, what I found when I did my research was that the most shameless, bald-faced efforts to influence people and to find techniques that work was when it came to selling things. In basic terms, if we as people had to think about every little decision, every option that we came across, we would soon be overwhelmed. We wouldn't be able to cope with the amount of decision-making that we need to make in that way. So to make life manageable, there's a whole host of things that our brains just do, and they do them without really thinking about them at all. A bowl of crisps? Yeah, pop one in. Don't really think about it. It just sort of happens, or at least it does for me. It's getting dark. I'll switch the light on. I need the toilet. You know what to do. You don't have to spend a long time deliberating about those sort of things. But there are things where we need to give consideration, where we need to spend a bit of time thinking about it. Now, a lot of the marketing attempts are to stop us from thinking. So, for example, you get adverts that might not even seem to have anything to do with the product that they're selling or the shop or whatever it is, but they tug on our heartstrings. They seek to get an emotional response that is linked to their brand. Or it might make it seem like if we don't act right now, we are going to miss out on this great opportunity, this great deal. Now, sometimes churches do engage in practices like this. And one of the ways that you can protect against unhealthy influence is to encourage people to have that moment to pause, to stop, and to think. When we invite people to become followers of Jesus, then it needs to be done in a healthy way. It needs to be done without pressure to rush a decision. And that's what Jesus is doing in this passage. There's no sugarcoating of it. There's no encouragement to rush in without being aware of exactly what's involved. You see, being an authentic disciple of Jesus, it's costly. And that's not to say that we are saved through our own efforts, that we pay the price, that we save ourselves. Jesus has rescued us, and he's done that through his death and by coming back to life and defeating death. And he did that for us, and that's what makes being saved, that's what salvation is, being saved. That's what makes it possible, what Jesus did. This is freely given to us, it's freely offered to us. It is a gift of grace. The great German theologian, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, he wrote a book called The Cost of Discipleship, which is exactly about that. And he warned against what he called cheap grace, and instead pointed to costly grace. And he wrote these words, which, even though it talks about men, I think it applies to women just as much as well. He said this: "Such grace is costly because it calls us to follow, and it is grace because it calls us to follow Jesus Christ. It is costly because it costs a man his life, and it is grace because it gives a man the only true life. It is costly because it condemns sin, and grace because it justifies the sinner. Above all, it is costly because it cost God the life of his Son. Ye were bought at a price, and what has cost God much cannot be cheap for us. Above all, it is grace because God did not reckon his Son too dear a price to pay for our life, but delivered him up for us. Costly grace is the incarnation of God." Now, Bonhoeffer was imprisoned, and he was executed by the Nazis in Germany. He knew what it meant to follow Jesus in a way that cost absolutely everything. Our passage today starts with Jesus talking about those who follow him having to hate their family. Now, Jesus is speaking in a sort of exaggerated way to make the point. And I think it might help if you imagine Jesus saying it with that twinkle in his eye, with the little grin as he's saying, because he knows he's being provocative here. He doesn't really want for people to hate their parents or to hate their siblings or their husbands or wives or whoever. He doesn't want us to hate anybody. But just imagine at the time the tongues that were wagging, the buzz that must have gone up from this crowd listening. Oh, you can't believe what he's just said. In a culture that placed an extremely high value on family, especially honouring parents, this was real controversial stuff that he was coming out with. And they knew that the only person who could make demands above something as important as family was God himself. Jesus wasn't just another man, he wasn't just another teacher, but he was God with us. He still is God with us. And what Jesus is saying is when we come to him, our love for him should be so great that others may react negatively to that. They may not like the fact that we love him so much. I firmly do believe that loving him connects us to the source of all love. And when we're connected to him in that way, we become better at loving those around us. We can show them more love because we are in love with Jesus. Now, some won't like it, but we mustn't compromise. We mustn't hold back from following Jesus and doing what he wants because of what others think and what they might say. Jesus goes on, and he says that the only way that you can be a disciple of his is to carry your cross and to follow him. Now, the cross was a brutal means of execution. It was used by the Romans who ruled the land at that time. And when someone was to be executed in that way, they would be forced to carry the crossbeam to the place where they would be executed. And they would do that amongst a sort of jeering mob who would shout and abuse and hurl things and all of that. It's not a pretty picture. Would anybody choose that? I read an article a few weeks ago, which I thought was quite interesting in how things have been recently. And it was talking about how quickly the lockdown church has moved from a cinema model where people gather and they sort of sit back and they watch what's going on, to a Netflix model where people can get what they want on demand. And if they don't like something, they can easily just change to watch something else. And I thought, I don't like that comparison. But those comparisons may be close to the truth. Jesus said, "Whoever does not carry their cross and follow me cannot be my disciple." And so I wondered on that thing I read, which model is that? Is that the cinema model? Is it the Netflix model? Or is it neither? Because it seems to me that the only way to be a disciple is to be active. It requires following even when it is painful, even when there's rejection, even when it means facing death. Jesus isn't looking for spectators. This is not about consumption, however much we might like it to be. To go back to the example I started with of grand designs, Jesus goes on to give a couple of illustrations of his own about the need to count the cost before setting out to follow him. So don't embark on building a tower when you don't know how much the thing's going to cost or where the money might even come from. Don't start a fight that there's no way that you can ever win. And don't set out to follow Jesus without understanding what the cost might be. See, the last bit that Jesus talks about in this passage, it's about salt, and salt that loses its saltiness. Now, the scholars who like to wrestle with every little tiny detail of these passages have spent much time, much effort, much ink, much paper, much typing, all of that, and debating whether it is actually possible for salt to lose its saltiness. I don't think that chemistry was what Jesus was wanting to emphasize here. But everyone knew that if you were cooking and something tasted bland, then adding salt would bring out the flavour. But if the salt wasn't salty, it would be a disaster. There wouldn't have been some sort of bottle of ketchup you could just pull out the cupboard and drown everything in the hope of getting some taste there. See, tasteless and insipid salt is no good. It's no good for anything, only to be thrown away. It isn't even good enough to put in the manure heap to stop it from, it's to do with how the manure matures and ferments. Lovely picture that, isn't it? It's not even useful for that. It is merely salt in name and appearance, and that is not really salt. Its crucial function is missing, so it's no good. And in the same way, a disciple without discipleship is not a disciple. Jesus wants us to take note of these warnings. So he finishes what he's saying with, "Whoever has ears to hear, let them hear." See, following Jesus is not really a decision that is just made in a moment, and that's it. It's a commitment, and it's a commitment to relationship with him, trusting him day by day, whatever it is we face, whatever it is we're going through, whatever it means. And I'm well aware that all this talk of cost might not sound like it's all that attractive, but we don't need to miss the positive side of it either. And let me just draw your attention to that too. See, the invitation to follow Jesus is made to all. It's made to me, it's made to you. Jesus wants you, he wants us to walk with him. He wants you to be part of what he's up to in the world. Another positive is that there is freedom in this. There is freedom that goes with following him because your primary allegiance is to him. It is not to other people. It's not to society. It's not to things. We are free in a way that many others are not. And as we follow him, as we take up our cross to follow him, we follow one who has already carried his cross. And he did that literally, didn't he? And he came out of the other side, the pains and sufferings of this life and not the end. There is more than what we experience at this time. There's more to look forward to, and it is worth it. There is hope in that. Following him gives meaning to our life that is bigger than what this life can contain. So in giving everything to him, actually we receive so much more. And like salt that is salty, the disciple brings flavour wherever they go. They rescue things that are bland and insipid. They bring life, they enliven the flavours. So don't miss the positive that's here, because there is positive in this, but neither miss that there's a really huge challenge as well. If you are a follower of Jesus, what does this mean for your discipleship? If you're not a follower of Jesus, then I encourage you to stop and think what this might mean for you. And if you want to explore it further and would like to have a chat with us, please do get in touch. We would love to help you look at what the next steps for you might be. Now, I've got some questions, and these are questions for further reflection to help us as we think about what all this means for us. We can use them as we gather together in our groups in Zoom in a few moments, and the details will come up at the end of this. Now, I've nicked these questions, to be honest. I've nicked them from a book by Darrell Bock, and he wrote a book all on Luke's Gospel. And I just thought that these were really useful for us as we consider what next. The first question is this: do I yield to the Lord in every area of my life, my possessions, my family, even my own life? And 2, do I really trust him to care for me? Or do I have to help him along by seizing control or by being careful that I avoid some of the tension that inevitably comes into the process when one takes a position of representing Jesus to a needy world? It's a bit of a long question, that, but we'll have them available later on. Thanks for watching today as we come to the end of this series on being authentic followers of Jesus, authentic disciples of Jesus. Do head to our website and fill in your contact details if we haven't got them already, so we can keep you in touch with what's going on. And look out for the information this week about the Kobe Against Coronavirus quiz. It's going to be taking place on Saturday. The idea is to have some fun together and to raise some money for World Vision at the same time. I hope that you'll be able to make it for that. As I finish, I want to just read a blessing. And this is a blessing from 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. And it says this: May our Lord Jesus Christ himself and God our Father, who loved us and by his grace gave us eternal encouragement and good hope, encourage your hearts and strengthen you in every good deed and word. Amen.